name's Kate Woodman, and I am a photographer based out of Portland, Oregon. So the first question, and it's a really big question, and it's a scary question, is where do we start? For this tutorial, we talked about going a number of different directions, but in the process of looking at locations and trying to figure out set design and all of that, I really started to think about what interests me. And I started to think about two things, and one is relationships. I'm really intrigued about how they manifest the dynamics between two people or multiple people. And that's one thing that's always been pretty consistent throughout my work. But ultimately, what's interesting to me as a photographer are a great concept and really great color. My goal for this tutorial for you guys, and what I want you to take away, is to have a really comprehensive understanding of color work. I want to talk about the technical aspects of color. I want you guys to start off being kind of overwhelmed and feeling like there's a ton of information. And then we're going to start distilling that, and we're going to start refining it, and we're going to start to realize how this is going to work together, how it's going to start playing into your own photography. And one of these days it's going to click, and you're going to feel like, holy crap, I got this. I've got color, and it makes sense. What is color? The answer to that is actually surprisingly simple. Color is basically just light. So if we have a white light source, for instance, and we pass it through a prism, that light gets dispersed and we end up with a spectrum of light. We get the colors of the rainbow. Each one of the colors of the rainbow corresponds to a different wavelength of light. So what does that mean? How do we get different colors? I've got Pantone 7548 here. It's a lovely shade of yellow. So the question is, why do we see this shade of yellow? What happens is that same white light that's being dispersed through that prism and it's creating this whole spectrum, that light is hitting this card. But instead of all of those colors dispersing or all of them reflecting back, this wavelength of light, just this wavelength, this yellow, is bouncing back, it's going into our eyes, and that is the color we're seeing. The rest of the wavelengths of light are being absorbed and we don't see them. So if I flip this over, we've got white. It's really light gray, but we'll call it white. What happens here is all of those colors in that spectrum are bouncing back and they're hitting your eye. And the opposite is true. So if we have a black shirt, for instance, the light is coming in, all of the color is being absorbed, and we're not getting any color back in our eye. In addition to the visual aspect of color, color also has a psychological component. When you have certain colors and you put them together, they can act in harmony, and this makes your eye happy, it makes your brain happy. We also have an emotional reaction to certain colors. So some colors can actually make you feel a certain way. Red can make your heart beat faster, and blue can make it slower. As photographers, I think we have been pretty well trained to constantly be observing lighting conditions in our environment. From the minute you wake up, you are assessing what the lighting situation is. Is it soft light? Is it hard light? We can do the same thing for color. So once you start training yourself to see color, then you can start really applying it to your own work. And at first, it'll be a conscious process, and you'll have to think a lot about it. But eventually, it'll become second nature, and your work's going to become great, and you're not even going to have to think about it. To understand the theory of color, we first have to understand the individual properties of color. There are 3 properties of color: hue, saturation, and luminosity. And these are terms that you probably have heard before or seen before, maybe in Photoshop, but let's take a step back and define what those terms actually mean. So our first color property is hue, and usually when we think of color, we're actually thinking of hues. So if we take our white light and we shine it through a prism, it's going to disperse into our rainbow or visible light spectrum. And each one of these wavelengths is going to correspond to an individual hue. Our second property of color is saturation, and saturation is basically the intensity or the vividness of a hue. So if we think of saturation in terms of mixing paints, if we take a gray paint and we add it to a highly saturated red paint, the more gray paint we add, the less saturated that hue becomes. If we've got a highly saturated image, it's going to feel lively, it's going to feel energetic, and there's going to be a lot of emotion associated with it. We can use saturation to draw our eye to a certain character or to a certain subject that we really want to focus on. Desaturated images tend to feel a bit more serious or somber or even ethereal. When we reduce the saturation, the image becomes more about the content and less about the color. So our last property of color is luminosity, and when we reduce all of the saturation in an image, we're left with a black and white image, and that's essentially just our luminosity. When we add white to a color, we increase the luminosity, and this is referred to as tinting. When we decrease the luminosity, we're adding black, and this is referred to as shading. If we're adding gray or something in the middle, this is referred to as toning. When we have low luminosity, we get low-key images. These are typically comprised of darker and richer colors. So we're going to invoke emotions of sadness and seriousness and despair, just to name a couple examples. High-key images have a higher luminosity and tend to be brighter, a little bit more commercial, and the colors tend to look more vibrant or more pastel. We also have something that's kind of in the middle, which is high contrast images, which is where we're going to incorporate a lot of low luminosity and high luminosity. And these tend to be really dramatic images because we've got a lot of contrast, and that can manifest in a number of different types of ways, but it's usually when we're looking for real drama in an image. All of our color properties have an interdependent nature, so if we're changing one color property, we're going to affect the other two. Each hue has what we call an inherent luminosity value, which is essentially a fancy way of saying that one hue may be perceived as lighter than another. Our yellow appears to be lighter than our blue, and this is shown more poignantly when we reduce the saturation of the yellow and the blue. Again, the yellow is going to be a lighter shade of gray, and the blue is going to be a darker shade of gray. So when we're changing hue, we're also changing luminosity. So each individual hue is going to have its own inherent luminosity values. Our yellow has the highest luminosity value, our blue has the lowest inherent luminosity value, and red is at about 50% and somewhere in between. And it's going to vary for each hue and hue wavelength in the spectrum. So how does saturation factor into all of this? Well, a hue is fully saturated at its inherent luminosity values. If we add white to our hue, we're increasing the luminosity, but we're also decreasing our saturation. Conversely, if we add black, we're decreasing our luminosity and we're also decreasing saturation. So to take that paint analogy further, we're actually going to have to add different amounts of black or white depending on the initial hue, depending on its inherent luminosity. When a lot of us think about harmony, we think about music and putting certain notes together. So if we have certain notes in a chord, and one of the notes is slightly off pitch, maybe it's a little sharp or a little flat, that is going to be really jarring to our brain. But when everything is in tune and everything is played together, it's going to create this really beautiful, harmonious ring, and the same thing is applying to color. So the concept of color harmonies was really first pioneered by this guy called Johannes Itten. He was a 20th century color theorist out of the Bauhaus school, and he came up with this notion that we've got 7 color harmonies that we all resonate with, and he wrote a book called The Art of Color, which covers these different color harmonies. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what those color harmonies are. Starting with the most basic of harmonies, here we've got our monochrome color harmony, which is basically using one color and a variety of tints and tones and variations of that hue to create some visual interest. If we add a second color and place it directly opposite the first one, we've now got our complementary color harmony. and it's pretty easy to add some visual interest or contrast to a scene by adding in the color's complement. Next, we've got a bit of a variation on the complementary harmony, and we can actually use two colors on either side of a color's complement rather than the actual complementary color. And this is called our split complementary. We can also do this to the other side and split that side up as well. So now we've got two complementary pairs directly adjacent to each other. This one's conveniently named the double split complementary. If we push these colors out now, so now they're evenly spaced around the color wheel, now we've got our square or quadratic color combination. And this harmony is actually comprised of two complementary pairs, but specifically pairs that are equidistant apart on the wheel. When we remove one of these colors, so we're back down to 3, we can arrange them so they're equally spaced around the wheel again for our triadic color harmony. And you'll perhaps notice that our primary colors make up a triadic color harmony, as do our secondary colors, and so on and so forth. And last but certainly not least is our analogous color harmony, which is what we get when we take our nice evenly spaced colors and we smush them all together on one side right next to each other. They don't necessarily have to be directly adjacent, but they're close enough so that we're sort of creating a little wedge out of the color wheel pie. We just went through all of our color harmonies. We walked through a couple examples for each individual color harmony that you saw. And now I just want to present you guys with a couple images and let you sit with them for a bit and sort of see if you can decipher the color harmonies for yourself. So starting with this one, this is a shot that I took around dusk with all the lights on inside. And I was kind of going through a Mad Men phase here. Really loved this kind of sad, beautiful woman and this guy walking out in the distance here. So as far as our color scheme goes, I sort of identify this as a primary RYB color scheme here. Got the blues in the sky and in the shadows. The house is actually brown, but it's got some bluish hints to it because of the overall color cast in the sky. Obviously, we've got the yellows in the windows, and red is the big accent color here. I wanted that red to be up front and center for a really dramatic effect. And you'll see too, there are some other little accent colors. There's a little bit of green, but to me, the overall color harmony is this red, yellow, blue. All right, here we've got another image. And I have a couple alcohol clients, and so I wanted to do a little bit of a test shoot here for that kind of moody, sultry girl drinking a glass of whiskey in the afternoon in her lingerie, because that's what you do. Color-wise, I wanted to sort of play on that tone of the whiskey, that kind of golden tone, and I wanted it to feel like this warm afternoon light. And so lighting-wise, I actually gelled both of my lights to get that really nice, warm, sunlit look. So I would actually call this a monochromatic color scheme. We really just have the color ranging from like a light beige to the nice saturated skin tones, which are a bit more of this golden orange color, and then we desaturate and reduce our luminosity a bit more for the table in the background. But ultimately, we're kind of within the same sort of one hue tonal range here. We've just got some variation on the luminosity. This image is from a fashion editorial I shot up in the Pacific Northwest, and we had this beautiful farm we were shooting on, and this designer had some really great clothes, nice earthen color, so we wanted to sort of play around with that. Color scheme-wise here, we've got this beautiful plum jumpsuit that our model is in, and because we were shooting on the farm, there was a lot of greenery. We were in the middle of summer, so a lot of this lush, beautiful color. And we also have this really nice golden glow to her skin tone, and skin tones are pretty often perceived by us as somewhere in the orange range. So we've actually got our secondary triadic color scheme here with the orange, the green, and the purple. So here we've got a conceptual piece that I shot fairly recently. This is this kind of weird dinner party scene where we've just got our one guest left, or maybe she's our host, and everyone's plates are kind of unfinished, but we don't know where everyone is. Color-wise, I knew I wanted it to look like it was nighttime, so we used a CTB gel on our light outside to make it look like we had this cool moonlight glow. And to contrast that, we've got the orangey tones in the spaghetti, we've got the orange of the kitchen cabinets, and I wanted to throw her in this orange dress, which makes her kind of pop off of screen, but it also is a nice complement to our blue. So this is our complementary color scheme of orange and blue. So this is actually a composite piece that I did and wanted to kind of play around with these badass girls with a can of gasoline, smoking cigarettes, playing with fire at a gas station. So as far as the color scheme goes, for this image, we've got our triadic primary color scheme. Again, we have blue in the night sky in the background as our kind of general atmosphere. We have the yellow lights and accents in the gas station. And we've also got some red accents in the fire extinguisher and the bucket and the railing of the gas station. And we've also brought in some additional red in the styling with the red jacket and the red gas can. This is an image that I shot in Chicago, and it actually was kind of a fortuitous image. We were shooting in an architectural salvage place, and when I walked in the door, I saw this really amazing kind of Art Deco art piece hanging on the wall. And then when we were going through our model's clothing, I found this really amazing suit, and I figured, I had to shoot it against her. It was kind of perfect. Color-wise, this is an interesting one to me, and people have kind of interpreted this in different ways. I think some people would call it complementary, and they're seeing kind of these red tones in the background against the green of the suit. But I see a little bit more of a range in color. I'm also picking up oranges and yellows. And so to me, I might even call this an analogous color scheme, but it's really analogous covering half of the wheel. But again, there's kind of this nice gradient of colors. So that's kind of what I would call this. But again, it's an interesting image because I think it shows how we can sort of perceive different color harmonies differently as individuals. I think a lot of photographers approach photography from a very technical perspective. We're focused on our camera settings, we're focused on lighting, and all of this stuff is really important. But I see a lot of people struggling with creating interesting images, and I think what's missing is a storytelling aspect to it. Something that a viewer can relate to, something that gives a narrative. And in this tutorial, that's what we're really going to be focusing on. Stories can take a lot of different forms, but ultimately there's kind of this overarching formula that makes them all work for the viewer. And this is called the narrative arc. We start with an introduction, setting the scene for the viewer. Next, we have our rising tension, and that's basically the plot development of the storyline. After that, we have the climax, where everything comes to a head. It's a pivotal moment in the scene. Finally, we have our resolution, the ending to the story. It's what happens after the climax. The couple lives happily ever after, somebody dies, whichever way your storyline goes. I personally like to leave the ending a little bit ambiguous. That kind of leaves something to the viewer's imagination and helps them engage with the storyline a little bit more. But ultimately, you need to have some kind of resolution to conclude the story and say this is a good stopping point. All four of those components there is critical to making sure your audience engages with your story. So the next thing I want to talk about is theme. And theme is something that is going to be sort of an overarching element of your storyline. It's going to apply to your entire narrative arc, to your plot. And kind of related to theme is emotion. We as human beings connect with emotion. We relate to that. That's what makes us engage with an image in the first place. So emotion is something that is really important to my stories and what I want to tell. I want someone to look at an image and be able to read an expression on someone's face, whether it's elation, whether it's sadness, whether it's an intensity. I think we can use theme and we can use our narrative arc to add depth and create layers. So maybe the second time around you see something you didn't see the first time. Maybe you noticed a prop you didn't see the first time. Maybe you even noticed a character in the background you didn't see the first time. By adding those little subtleties to your images, it adds a maturity to an image you wouldn't necessarily otherwise have. So I understand how intimidating it sounds to have all of these aspects and trying to remember to incorporate all of these things into a story. We can still add layers and add complexity to an image, even if the parameters are confined, even if it's a tight shot and a tight portrait. We can use color to tell that story. We can use emotions to engage with the viewer. So I think all of this is scalable, and that's something that's still really important to keep in the back of your head, regardless of the complexity of the image you're trying to shoot. What I like about all of these different parameters is it keeps me accountable. So anytime I'm struggling through the process, if I don't know where to go in the storyline, or if I don't know where to place certain props in the scene, I go through that checklist. I say, am I hitting this narrative arc? Does it make sense as far as the plot and the storyline? Am I getting emotion into the scene? Am I following the theme? Does everything kind of tick off that checklist? And if it does, then I'm going to have a much more successful story. We talked about creating an interesting narrative, using a narrative arc, using theme, using emotions, all of these different components put together to make an interesting story. Now, as photographers, we have to do this in a finite number of images. So you really need to make sure that you are getting all of the necessary detail in each image to properly convey that storyline. Now let's talk a little bit about the quantity of images you need to make a story. I don't think that there is one perfect number. If you have enough detail, if you have enough components, if the storyline is concise enough, you can create a world within a single image. So how do we take these things like theme and emotion and layers and adding complexity and represent that visually in our storyline? I like to start with framing personally. Framing helps to give context, and it helps to showcase the important aspects of your image. You can get really close into a character because that character is so important to your storyline that that's all that really is, and that's all that matters. We can also approach framing from different angles. So we can kind of obscure behind a door, for instance, and that has a voyeuristic feel to it. We can shoot from up above to give a sense of vulnerability. If you're looking down on someone, they're beneath you, they're smaller than you, they're vulnerable. And conversely, we can flip that around. If we shoot from a lower angle looking up at someone, that can give them a sense of power and a sense of presence. That's going to convey a certain emotion just by where you put your lens. Lighting is another strategy that we can use to help facilitate the narrative. If you want a really moody scene, maybe you're going to use dim lighting, you're going to use a hard light source, you're going to create as much shadow as possible because that adds kind of an intensity to the scene or a somberness to it. Or you could go the other way around. You could blow everything out. You could use a lot of really soft light, and that's going to give it more of an ethereal quality or maybe a kind of a high-key, happy feel to it as well. For me personally, I really like to use lighting in a way that feels motivated. I don't want to use lighting that draws attention to itself or doesn't make sense in the context of what's happening within the scene. So for me, that's if you're using a lamp in the space, I want whatever light is hitting my subject to feel like it's coming from that lamp. And I think this adds to the believability of the storyline. It makes it feel almost like your viewer is there with you. They're kind of immersed in the scene. Color is also an incredibly powerful tool in storytelling. We as humans associate colors with so many different things. They bring in so much context. And knowing that and kind of having a grasp of how those colors react with you or with anyone else, we can harness that power. We can use that color in different ways. We can overwhelm people with that color, using a lot of it to instill like a very strong sense of whatever response you're looking for. We can use it subtly. We can use just a hint of it to draw our eye to a certain area. We can pair it with other colors to create either harmony or a discord, depending on what we're looking for within our storyline. I'm going to show you everything about my process using a case study for this tutorial. So everything from coming up with a concept, putting together a mood board, putting together a narrative arc. You'll be with me on location as I shoot this. We're at the Ungut Arts Hotel, which was the inspiration for this entire concept. I probably will shoot from a little bit further down. I'm seeing this nice diagonal composition, so it creates a really nice leading line. I will be showing you post-production as well. We have this little bit of the ceiling showing here, so I'm going to use our plate to extend our curtain up to the ceiling. And you'll see everything kind of come together from beginning to end. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have an idea of how you want to create your own story in your images.